The Duke did not simply give Eleanor Vance a ruined
You have nothing
greenhouse.
left, Eleanor.
He made certain it could not survive. With
I still
snow
have this,
already
Henry.
blowing through its shattered roof, Henry Cavendish struck the last intact pane with his gold-topped cane, handed Eleanor the deed, and forbade every coal mine and glassworks under his control from selling to her. Then he gave her 35 days. In 5 weeks, a royal commission would arrive to decide whether her father's Cinchona project, the source of life-saving quinine, deserved to continue. Henry expected the tropical plants to freeze long before then. For 3 nights, it looked as though he was right. Eleanor lost nearly a third of her precious seedlings. But while examining the wreckage, she noticed something that should have been impossible. Outside, the iron columns were covered in frost. One column inside the greenhouse was warm, and somewhere beneath the stone floor, she could hear water moving. The Duke had left her a dead glasshouse because he believed he had taken away its only source of heat. He had never asked what was buried underneath it. Snow had already buried the lower steps of the glass skeleton when Henry Cavendish placed the deed on a cracked propagation table. "You may keep it," the Duke said. Eleanor Vance looked past the paper at what remained of the conservatory. Half the vaulted roof stood open to the storm. Jagged panes clung to rusted cast-iron ribs. Snow had gathered across the stone floor in white drifts, except where sulphurous steam rose through a fissure near the eastern columns and melted it into dirty channels. Henry rested both hands on his gold-topped cane. "You will receive no coal from my mines, no glass from my works. In 35 days, the commission may inspect whatever is still alive." The cinchona seeds inside Eleanor's coat seemed suddenly heavier. 5 weeks. Then physicians appointed to examine Britain's failing quinine supply would decide whether her father's work deserved another season or disappeared with his name. If the plants failed, Henry's imported bark would remain the only supply powerful buyers could obtain through his network. He turned toward the door, then stopped beneath the last large pane still hanging above them. The cane rose once. Glass broke with a hard, clean crack. Fragments fell through the iron frame and vanished into the snow. "That should spare you the trouble of waiting for spring," he said. Eleanor did not answer. She picked up the deed, folded it once, and slipped it inside her coat beside the seed pouch. Only after Henry's carriage had disappeared behind the storm did she begin walking the greenhouse. The ordinary damage was obvious: missing glazing, frozen benches, broken drains, mineral stains, soil soured by years of seepage. She ignored the center beds and crouched beside the eastern frame. Steam leaked from the floor there. A rusted flange sat beneath the nearest column, almost hidden by scale. Eleanor removed one glove and pressed her palm against the cast iron. The metal was not warm enough to burn, but it was warmer than the air. She moved to the next pillar. Cold. The third was cold as well. Eleanor returned to the first and placed her hand against it again, while hot water whispered somewhere below the stone. Henry had left her a greenhouse without fuel, so why was one of its iron bones carrying heat? Elias Pritchard arrived before noon with a leather tool roll, a bent pipe wrench, and the cough Eleanor remembered from her father's laboratory years before. He spent less than a minute looking at the broken roof. "The glass is the expensive part," he said. Eleanor pointed instead to the warm eastern pillar. "That is why I asked you here." They began at its base. Elias scraped mineral scale from the flange with a narrow chisel, while Eleanor followed the rusted line beneath the benches. The pipes disappeared under stone, reappeared beside 3 columns, then vanished again beneath a collapsed planting bed. She struck each pillar lightly with the wooden handle of his hammer. 2 answered with a dull, clogged note. The first rang hollow. Elias stopped coughing long enough to listen. That was once carrying something. He fitted the wrench around the lowest flange. It resisted until both of them leaned into it. Rust cracked. A bolt snapped. Then the joint opened half an inch. Hot mineral water spilled into their bucket. Steam climbed between them. Eleanor crouched beside it and studied the direction of the pipework. The spring chamber lay lower than the eastern frame. The return channel, if it still existed, descended toward the opposite wall. She had drawn systems like this for botanical houses before circuits that moved heated water without constant pumping using elevation, cooling, and the pressure created by the water itself. "The columns are part of it," she said. Elias looked along the iron ribs overhead. "If the passages are still open." They spent the afternoon testing them. A wire probe passed nearly 6 feet into one section before striking scale. Another pipe was completely blocked. Beneath a cracked slab, they found the remains of a return line crushed by fallen stone. The greenhouse had not lost its heating system. It had lost circulation. That distinction mattered. Eleanor drew 3 columns in her notebook: save, abandon, test. The western beds went under abandon. The contaminated soil would never hold Cinchona safely, so she marked raised troughs for later. The eastern circuit went under save. Then Elias named the cost. New fittings, ceiling compound, labor, and enough digging to reach the broken return would consume almost everything she had left. Eleanor looked up through the empty roof. Snow had begun falling again. If she spent the money on pipework, she could not properly cover the nursery. If she covered the nursery first, the buried circuit might remain useless until after the next freeze. Elias closed his tool roll. "The storm reaches us tomorrow night." Eleanor looked at the warm pillar, then at the open sky above it. She had enough money to solve only one problem first. Eleanor chose the nursery first. It was the faster answer, and speed had begun to matter more than elegance. By dusk, she and Elias had stretched oiled canvas across the eastern bay, tying it to the iron ribs with cord and sealing the worst gaps with resin. Beneath it, Eleanor raised the cinchona trays off the stone on rough timber blocks and placed 3 small charcoal braziers around them. The arrangement reminded her of the heating plans she had once drawn for botanical museums, except those rooms had possessed intact roofs, measured ventilation, and budgets large enough to correct mistakes before plants paid for them. Her father had taught her grafting at the same work tables where she learned to calculate heat loss. He had insisted that plants rarely failed for one reason. Roots, light, moisture, temperature alter one badly enough, and the others followed. Outside, the storm deepened. For the first night, the canvas appeared to work. No frost formed directly on the trays. Eleanor moved between the braziers every hour, adjusting their distance by inches. Near midnight, the thermometer beside the center bench remained safely above freezing. She allowed herself no celebration. Morning exposed the flaw. The seedlings closest to the charcoal had curled at the edges. The air there felt dry against her lips. At the far end of the enclosure, condensation soaked the canvas and dripped cold water onto 2 trays. Worse, the light beneath the oil-darkened cloth was weak, even after sunrise. By the second afternoon, the first leaves had turned yellow. Eleanor opened every available flap, but the temperature dropped almost immediately. She closed them again, moved one brazier, then another. Each adjustment corrected one problem and worsened the next. On the 3rd morning, she counted the losses. 11 seedlings had collapsed completely. Several more showed no chance of recovery. Nearly 1/3 of the precious early growth was gone. Elias stood beside the dead trays without speaking. The charcoal still glowed. That was what angered her most. They had produced plenty of heat and still failed. Eleanor lifted the nearest thermometer and walked from one end of the bay to the other. The readings changed sharply over only a few yards. Then she looked up at the canvas, blocking the pale winter sun. "Put them out," she said. Elias glanced at the braziers. "All of them?" "All of them." He began covering the coals with ash. Eleanor pulled the first canvas tie loose. She had been trying to make the greenhouse hotter. The plants needed something harder. Heat that arrived evenly, light that remained usable, and humidity that did not swing with every fire. She looked toward the warm eastern pillar. They would not burn another pound of fuel. If the cinchona survived, the iron itself would have to keep it alive. They opened the eastern circuit at dawn. Elias removed the first access plate, while Eleanor marked the pipe, runs in chalk across the stone floor. Mineral scale had narrowed some passages to the width of a finger. They worked section by section, scraping with chisels, feeding iron rods through bends, and flushing loosened deposits into buckets before the debris could settle farther down the line. The first serious failure came before noon. A corroded flange split when Elias tightened it. Hot water sprayed across the floor. Eleanor shut the inlet valve at once and watched the pressure fall. Replacing the fitting would cost money they did not have, so she abandoned a dead western branch, removed its sound flange, and had Elias fit that one into the eastern circuit instead. They were no longer repairing the whole greenhouse. They were choosing what deserved to live. By afternoon, the buried return line became the greater problem. Fallen stone had crushed one section beneath an old bed. 2 laborers hired for half a day lifted slabs, while Elias exposed enough pipe to cut around the collapse. Eleanor redirected the return through a shorter route, sacrificing several unused benches to save time. When they opened the inlet again, the spring water moved. At first, it moved too fast. One joint began to hiss. Eleanor reduced the valve, waited, then opened it by degrees. The eastern pillar warmed first. The next followed several minutes later. Then another. Water whispered through the hollow cast iron above them. For the first time, the structure itself was distributing heat. They spent what remained of the daylight closing the nursery bay. Mica scraps went into smaller frames. Salvaged glass covered the clearest sections above the propagation tables. Resin and glazing putty sealed the worst gaps. Nothing matched, but the roof no longer stood completely open to the sky. That night Eleanor took readings every hour. The first was disappointing. The second was better. After midnight, the air outside fell hard enough to freeze water in an exposed bucket. Inside the eastern bay, the temperature stayed above frost. Not tropical, not yet, but alive. Elias leaned against a pillar and listened to the low movement of water inside it. "I thought these were finished," he said. Eleanor wrote the final reading in her notebook. So did the Duke. At sunrise, she uncovered the surviving cinchona trays. The leaves had not blackened. Then, she checked the first experimental graft. Its stem had softened at the union. The greenhouse could now hold warmth. The roots were still failing. The failing grafts forced Eleanor to stop blaming the air. She lifted one plant from its trough and broke the root ball apart with her fingers. The outer fibers were gray, soft, and sour, with mineral contamination that had climbed through the old soil from below. Heat was no longer the enemy. The ground was. By noon, she had abandoned every original planting bed. Elias helped her raise timber troughs on stone blocks, clear of the floor, while Eleanor filled them with clean loam, leaf mold, and coarse grit hauled in by cart. The cinchona would live above the poisoned ground, or not at all. For the grafts, she stopped asking one plant to do 2 jobs. A hardier cinchona line from her father's surviving stock had always grown vigorously, but produced weak, medicinal bark. Eleanor cut those stems low and used them as rootstock. Onto each she fitted a narrow scion from the higher alkaloid strain, matching cambium edges with a grafting knife sharpened until it could shave paper. She bound each union with waxed cloth. The first 2 dried out. A third rotted under excess moisture. Eleanor changed the shade, loosened the wrapping, and reduced misting around the next set. She marked every failure instead of hiding it. 6 days later, one union had formed a pale ridge of callus. 2 mornings after that, a green bud opened above it. Outside, frost silvered the broken western bays. Inside the repaired eastern section, the thermometer held near 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and moisture beaded evenly across the mica, without dripping onto the leaves. Eleanor wrote the figures down twice. A living graft was not a cure, and it was not yet a crop, but it was proof. That afternoon, Thomas Hale, the local station master, arrived carrying his 12-year-old son. The boy had been suffering recurrent fever, and the village physician had exhausted the remedies at hand. Eleanor did not touch the new plants. Instead, she opened the small tin containing the last standardized bark from her father's mature research stock. Under the physician's supervision, a measured preparation was given. By morning, the boy's fever had broken. Hale returned that evening with an empty railway crate and placed it beside the greenhouse door. "Anything you need moved," he said. "You tell me where." Eleanor looked from the crate to the rows of grafted cinchona. She had gained more than a healthy bud. For the first time, Someone outside the glass skeleton had seen useful proof and chosen to stand beside it. Then a bark sample from the surviving mature stock produced a chemical reaction far stronger than Eleanor expected. The stronger reaction meant nothing until someone else could reproduce it. Eleanor cut 3 bark samples from the mature stock and weighed each on her father's brass balance. One came from a plant kept under the restored geothermal conditions. One came from older greenhouse material. The third was imported bark Thomas Hale, obtained through a pharmacist supplied by Henry's trading network. She wrapped each in plain paper and marked them only with numbers. Temperature records, cutting dates, and dry weights traveled separately. Hale carried the packet to the railway himself. 2 days later, before any result returned, a Manchester drug merchant appeared at the glass skeleton with an offer large enough to pay Eleanor's remaining debts and replace half the broken roof with proper glass. He wanted every ounce of mature bark she could spare. Eleanor looked through the patched mica at the rows of grafts. Most were still too young to yield anything. Selling the mature stock would turn 5 weeks of work into immediate money, but it would leave the commission with no meaningful material to test and no parent plants for further propagation. She refused. The merchant raised his price. She refused again. That evening, Elias found her counting the remaining bark by lamplight. "You could have finished the roof," he said. "For 1 winter," Eleanor answered. She returned the bark to its locked cabinet. The chemist's report arrived the following afternoon. Eleanor read it standing beside the warm eastern pillar. The imported commercial sample yielded barely above 1% recoverable quinine compounds and varied sharply between repeated tests. Her older stock performed better. The fresh material grown under the stabilized greenhouse conditions reached nearly 5%. She checked the figures again. The important result was not simply that one sample was stronger. The repeated measurements clustered closely together. Consistency, that was what military medicine required. A rare plant could be admired. A repeatable supply could replace a contract. Eleanor immediately ordered the strongest mature plants protected from further cutting. The next harvest would be smaller, not larger. She needed enough bark for the commission, but she needed living propagation stock more. She spent the evening updating every temperature record and graft count, so no one could accuse her of presenting one fortunate specimen. 30 miles away, Henry Cavendish received a different report. A pharmacist had requested another sample from his latest imported shipment. A railway clerk had moved coated botanical packets toward London, and a drug merchant who usually bought through Henry's agents had visited Eleanor Vance. Henry set down the paper and unfolded a map of the adjoining estates. His finger stopped on the narrow parcel directly south of the glass skeleton. Then he asked his steward one question. How high is the winter sun at noon? By the beginning of the 4th week, the eastern bay no longer depended on Eleanor's hands alone. 2 local laborers had learned how far to open the inlet valve before the joints began to complain. Elias showed them how to listen for trapped air in the iron columns. Thomas Hale brought crates of clean loam, salvaged mica, and fresh lamp oil on the afternoon train. The grafting benches had doubled. So had the records. Each morning, Eleanor marked temperature, humidity, new bud growth, failed unions, and the amount of bark remaining for the commission. The glass skeleton was becoming more than a successful experiment. It was becoming a system another person could repeat. That was when the wagons arrived on the southern parcel. Henry's men did not cross Eleanor's boundary. They did not touch a pipe, break a pane, or threaten a worker. They simply unloaded timber. By sunset, the first section of wall stood 12 feet high. The estate papers called it a storage screen and winter windbreak. Henry owned the ground. Nothing in the wording mentioned Eleanor. Nothing needed to. The next morning, the low winter sun rose behind the boards. A broad shadow swallowed the greenhouse. Eleanor stood beneath the repaired roof and watched the light disappear from the propagation tables inch by inch. The heating circuit continued to work perfectly. That almost made the damage worse. At 82 degrees, with moisture beating steadily on the mica, the cinchona should have been thriving. Instead, the youngest leaves began turning toward whatever weak brightness remained from the north. Within 2 days, growth slowed. Within 4, the first leaves dropped. Eleanor measured everything. She moved 3 benches toward the western edge. The gain was negligible. She cut back shading cloth. It made no difference. She calculated how much healthy stock could survive until the commission, if the southern light never returned. Less than half. Elias wanted to confront the builders. Eleanor stopped him. "They are not attacking the greenhouse," she said. "They are attacking one condition it cannot replace." Heat was abundant now. Light was not. On the 5th afternoon, she found a young graft leaning toward a narrow brightness near the floor. The source was not the sky. A polished copper valve plate on the heating line had caught a weak band of northern light and thrown it beneath the leaves. Eleanor crouched beside it. She shifted the plate with 2 fingers. The bright patch moved across the bench. Henry had blocked the sun in a straight line. He had not blocked every path the light could take. Thomas Hale brought the first scrap metal before sunrise. Copper boilerplate, tarnished tin, 2 cracked mirrors from a hotel renovation. None of it was large enough to replace a wall of sunlight. But Eleanor was no longer trying to replace it. She was trying to redirect what remained. The first attempt failed badly. Elias mounted a polished copper sheet beside the nearest bench, while Eleanor adjusted its angle against the weak northern light. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the sun cleared a cloud, and the reflected beam tightened across one row of cinchona. A leaf blistered before Eleanor reached it. She pulled the plate down at once. Too much in one place. The mistake changed the design. Instead of concentrating light, she spread it. By noon, smaller reflectors hung at different heights along the iron frame. Eleanor marked their positions with chalk, then shifted each one a fraction at a time until diffuse light crossed the benches without forming hot spots. Condensation became the next obstacle. Within an hour, moisture dulled the brightest surfaces. 2 workers began wiping the metal on a timed rotation, while Elias built simple brackets that allowed each reflector to be adjusted without removing it. There was still not enough light for every plant. Eleanor counted the stock twice. Then she made the decision she had avoided for 3 days. The weakest grafts were removed from the heated zone. Some had already shed too many leaves. Others showed poor unions or weak roots. Saving them would divide warmth, labor, and reflected light across plants, unlikely to survive the commission. Nearly half the failing stock was carried out. The empty spaces made the greenhouse look defeated. The remaining plants did not. By the 2nd afternoon, leaf drop had slowed. By the 3rd, several buds had begun moving again. Eleanor checked the light path against the chalk marks, then compared it with the previous week's growth records. The recovery was small, but measurable. Enough. That evening, a message arrived from the commission offering to postpone the inspection because of the weather. Eleanor read it beside the warm iron pillar. A delay would give Henry more time to tighten his control over transport, supply, and land. She wrote her answer immediately. The commission should come on the appointed day. At dawn, Thomas Hale watched Henry Cavendish's carriage pass the station road toward London. A locked case rode inside beside him. Imported cinchona bark. Henry was no longer betting that Eleanor's greenhouse would die. He was preparing to prove that what it produced did not matter. The commission arrived under a sky the color of iron. Henry Cavendish came separately, carrying a polished case of imported cinchona bark and the confidence of a man accustomed to having quality defined by the contracts he controlled. Eleanor began with the greenhouse. No speech. She opened the eastern access plate and let the inspectors see the system working. Outside, frost still held in the shaded ground. Inside, the inlet temperature was recorded, then the temperature at the 3rd pillar, then the return flow at the far end of the circuit. No coal furnace burned anywhere. Water moved through the hollow iron columns with the same low whisper that had once sounded beneath a ruin. One physician asked Elias who operated the valves when Eleanor was absent. Elias pointed to the 2 laborers. They demonstrated the morning sequence themselves. The first proof was not Eleanor's skill. It was that her skill had become a process. At the propagation benches, the botanists examined the second proof. Healthy graft unions, new buds, raised troughs isolated from the mineral ground, mature stock preserved instead of stripped for quick profit. Eleanor showed them the failures too. Dead grafts remained labeled by date and cause. The survival rate was not perfect. It was documented. Henry waited until they reached the assay room. "My supply," he said calmly, "already serves an empire. Miss Vance has produced a handful of plants." The chemist ignored him. Both bark samples were coded. A reagent produced the expected quinine reaction in each, though the imported sample was weaker. Then came the measurement that mattered. Henry's shipment yielded barely above 1% recoverable quinine compounds and varied sharply between repeated tests. Eleanor's fresh material approached 5% and held within a narrow range. The chemist compared the figures with the independent samples received days earlier. They matched. Henry's hand tightened once around the gold head of his cane. He changed his argument. "One greenhouse cannot supply an army." Eleanor did not answer. A commissioner turned instead to her propagation records. Number of viable grafts. Number of trained workers. Heating capacity per bay. Expected expansion if a second circuit were restored. The answer had been prepared before Henry asked the question. By afternoon, the War Office representative suspended expansion of his current supply agreement pending a quality investigation. No one applauded. Henry simply closed the polished case he had brought to defeat her. But Eleanor knew the struggle was not finished. He still owned the southern parcel, the quarry access, and enough land around the glass skeleton to make every future winter expensive. She had proved the greenhouse could live. Now, she had to make certain Henry could never decide whether it was allowed to. The investigation did not ruin Henry Cavendish in a day. It did something more damaging. The War Office froze new purchases from his latest shipments, while independent chemists examined their grading and declared strength. Buyers who had once accepted his prices without question began demanding assays before payment. Cargo already sitting in his warehouses lost value by the week. 3 weeks after the commission's visit, Henry returned to the glass skeleton carrying no polished case. Only papers. The settlement protected Eleanor's southern light through a permanent easement. It granted her independent access to the quarry road and required the timber screens to be removed. A research grant would fund a second heating circuit, additional propagation bays, and wages for trained workers. Henry read the terms once before signing. "I believed that if I denied you coal and glass, the greenhouse would fail," he said. Eleanor waited. His eyes moved toward the iron columns. "And when it did not, I used the land to make it fail." There was no apology large enough to correct what he had done to her father, the medical supply, or the people who had depended on it. Eleanor did not ask for one. "The wall comes down first," she said. Henry signed. By the end of the month, Elias Pritchard no longer crawled beneath stone floors. He supervised 2 younger pipe fitters and taught them how mineral scale changed the sound of a hollow column. Thomas Hale established a regular rail schedule for plant material and coded samples. The 2 laborers who had once wiped condensation from reflectors received permanent wages. The glass skeleton did not become beautiful. Not quickly. Its roof remained a patchwork of mica and salvaged glass. Rust scars stayed visible on the oldest columns. Several reflectors still hung beside the southern benches because Eleanor trusted useful imperfections more than appearances. But the system worked. The first grafts prepared for another experimental greenhouse left by rail before the last winter's snow had melted. On that morning, Eleanor stood beside the eastern pillar with her grafting knife and cut a healthy scion from the strongest parent plant. Outside, workers pulled down the final section of Henry's timber wall. Beyond them, his carriage waited on the road. Snow covered the ground exactly as it had on the day he gave her the deed. Inside, warm water moved through the hollow cast-iron ribs with a low, steady whisper. Condensation gathered on the mica. Rows of cinchona leaves turned toward the returning light. Henry had left her an iron skeleton because he believed nothing living could remain inside it. Eleanor watched the next crate close around the graft. Then she sent part of that living system somewhere he could no longer control.